Adjustable suspension. High-end motorcycles have had them for a while, but TVS Motors is democratizing the technology with this, the Apache RR 310 BTO. BTO stands for Built to Order, and you can now order an Apache straight from the factory with fully adjustable suspension. This particular bike here is fully kitted out from the BTO program. So you've got the race kit with lower clip-ons, higher set foot pegs, a brass chain. It's also got the race livery on it, which is why it looks so flashy. But what we're interested in is the dynamic kit, which gives it completely new fully adjustable suspension. Up front, you've got KYB forks, adjustable for preload, rebound, and compression. At the back, you've got a new monoshock, again adjustable for rebound and preload. But what is adjustable suspension? To people not in the know, it's like a dark art, you know, it's so confusing. Preload, rebound, compression, clicks. What do all of these things mean? Well, we've got Kunal here. Kunal runs Slipstream Performance. It's a workshop here in Pune, and he's been doing so since 2004. And he is a master in adjustable suspension. A lot of people come here to set up their motorcycles. Professional racers, Ashish Raurane, the only Indian to take on the Dakar in the Male Moto category, he sets up his motorcycle here. Welcome, Kunal. You're the perfect man to explain adjustable suspension. But before we get into the details, tell us, why is adjustable suspension important?
Yeah, Atish, it's nice to be on your video, and so like you said, you know, more and more motorcycles are coming out with adjustable suspension, and it's great to see like the smaller CC motorcycles as well, you know, being launched with adjustable suspension. And adjustable suspension is just like the name implies. It basically gives you control over your motorcycle via adjusting your suspension. If you think about it, it's like you know, going and buying a suit off the rack. You know, if you do that, it might not fit you as well as getting a tailor-made bespoke suit. So yeah, I mean, that's in a nutshell, that's what adjustable suspension is.
Okay, but getting a tailor-made bespoke suit is pretty easy. You go to the tailor, they measure you up, and they stitch you the suit. But adjustable suspension comes with a lot of jargon. Preload, compression, rebound. These words, they mean things, and they affect how the motorcycle behaves on the road. So in this video, we want to talk about all of these things, break things down, and really truly understand what these things mean and how they can affect your riding. Now you have a motorcycle with adjustable suspension. What is your starting point?
So with any adjustable suspension, the first thing that you got to do is actually set up rider sag, and we do that with the preload adjusters.
I'm going to stop you right there. That's another word that we haven't heard before. What is rider sag?
Okay, so rider sag is basically setting up the motorcycle ride height for that particular rider, and we do that using the preload adjusters on the front fork as well as the rear shock. And what that basically does is it's going to set up you know, the suspension to work within your total travel. So you know, a motorcycle, when you look at the specifications, you have a total travel. So it's basically, preload is basically calculated on your total travel, and that helps set up your rider sag so that the suspension works to the best, you know, the way it's designed.
And now, why is setting up the preload important?
So like I said earlier, I mean, you have a total amount of suspension travel. So you need to basically set up preload so that the suspension is working at its best within the amount of travel that you have. If you increase your preload, you're going to have the suspension sitting higher in the suspension stroke, and if I reduce the preload or take preload off the spring, you're going to have the suspension and the motorcycle basically sitting lower to the ground. That's going to also reduce things like ground clearance.
Okay, so now does changing preload affect the stiffness or the softness of the suspension?
So I mean, that's a misconception, and it's been around for a while. So it's easy to think that if you put preload on your spring, it's going to, you know, make the spring stiffer or softer, but that's not actually the case. You can't make your suspension stiffer by increasing the preload. For that, you need to change the spring rate. What you actually do when you increase the preload is you're increasing the force on the spring before you put anything on the motorcycle, and that actually has an effect on the way the suspension you know, works, because you're going to need to put more force for the suspension to compress. So if you add more preload, you're going to need more force to actually get the suspension to start moving. So for example, if I put too much preload on a motorcycle front fork or shock, you're going to find that the ride gets a little harsh because it will not really react to smaller undulations in the road.
So it gives you the impression of making things a little bit stiffer or a little bit softer, but if you actually want to change the stiffness of your suspension, you need to swap out the springs.
Yeah, it gives you the misconception because, like I said, it's going to take more force for the suspension to actually initiate the stroke, but it's not actually making the suspension stiffer.
Okay, so what does a rider look for in terms of feedback from the motorcycle when it comes to adjusting preload? Does the motorcycle tell you anything to say that, okay, I need the preload changed?
So, I mean, if the preload setting is really out of the ballpark, you could have issues where the suspension tops out because there's too much preload for that person's weight, or if there's too little preload, you might have the suspension bottoming. But generally, we don't look at preload like that. Because any motorcycle that comes off the dealer floor, it's a brand new motorcycle. If you're lucky and your weight kind of prescribes to what the motorcycle is built for. So like for this motorcycle, I know it's 65 kilos of rider weight. So if that happens, then you're going to be in the ballpark, and you don't really need to set up the preload because it's going to work for you, straight off the factory floor. But for other people, who are heavier and you're outside, the initial setup of the motorcycle, you should basically look at setting up preload the minute you get the bike off the dealership floor, or if the dealership guys do that for you, that's great as well. So you don't want to set up preload where it is bottoming or topping out. The best thing is to get a baseline setting and just set the preload off the dealership floor.
Understood. Now let's get into this Apache. Let's set up the preload for me, who's going to be riding this motorcycle. What's the first step in the process?
So the first step in this process is I'm going to ask you how heavy you are. What's your weight?
I'm around 65 kgs.
So,
62 actually.
Okay, so I mean, if you're 62 or 65, you're in the ballpark for this motorcycle.
With the gear, it'll probably be 65.
So I think, yeah, so if your body weight's 62 and you're going to be 65 kilos with the weight, you're lucky. That's less work for me. This is going to be set up straight off.
Okay, but for the viewers, let's go through the entire process of setting up preload.
Yeah, so I mean, like the first thing we do is I need to know the suspension travel of the motorcycle. I believe for this motorcycle, the front forks have 125 millimeters of total travel, and I think for the rear it's about 135 millimeters. I'm just going to check the specifications in a minute. But like it doesn't have to be perfect as long as it's in the ballpark. And then once I know that, I'm going to basically make sure that both the front and rear suspension is unloaded, and then I will measure out the total travel there. And once I have you sit on the motorcycle with your gear, helmet, boots and all that, and then we're going to deduct that and basically come to a particular rider sag that we're looking for.
Cool.
So I'm now going to adjust the rider sag on the motorcycle. I'm going to get Atish to sit on the bike for me to do that, and as you can see, he's fully kitted out in his gear, so the rider weight is right on the money. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the front preload, and then move on to adjusting the rear suspension preload. And I'm going to adjust the preload so that the rider sag is correct for Atish's weight and for the particular suspension travel that we have on this motorcycle. So Atish, I'm going to get you to lift the bike, and you basically need a tape measure and a few tools. For the front end, I'm going to need a 14mm spanner to actually turn the preload adjuster, so I'm going to do that right now. So I'm measuring out the total travel. So I've got 160 millimeters on the front with the suspension unloaded. Atish, you can put the bike down now, and I'm going to need you to sit on top of the motorcycle. Okay, so you got your side stand up. So I'd like to point out that for this adjustment, you will either need a paddock stand to hold the bike up vertically, or the rider will need to lean against a wall. In this case, we're not using either, so I have Ram supporting the motorcycle from the rear. The bike is off the side stand, and I'm going to get Atish to pump the forks now. Atish, can you just push the forks down? So I'm going to take my tape measure. So I'm now measuring how much the suspension has closed after the rider has pumped the fork. And the measurement I've got is 120 millimeters of sag. And the reason I got Atish to basically bounce the fork before I took this measurement is I wanted the forks to overcome any stiction in the fork seals and bushings, so it's settled at the right height for me to measure it out. The earlier initial measurement I took with the wheel unloaded, the total travel was 160 millimeters. So I'm just going to minus these two numbers and I come to a figure of 40 millimeters. For this bike, I'm going to be setting the sag at 30% of the total travel, which works out to roughly about 35 millimeters. So for Atish's weight, there's too little preload on this because we've got too much sag. So I'm going to now move to adjusting the preload at the fork. And you generally want to be doing this adjustment with about a half tank of gas. You don't want it to be empty or the tank full. That way you get better adjustment. Same thing, Atish, bounce the bike. So at this point I've got the correct rider sag that I was looking at. If you remember, the number we were looking for was 35 millimeters, and that's exactly what we have right now. So at this point, at least the front suspension is correctly set up for Atish's weight. I'm going to now move to the rear shock and do the same. So with setting up the rear preload, it's technically the same way, but the only difference being is that for checking the rear shock, I'm going to take a measurement which is repeatable from somewhere on the motorcycle to the end of the swing arm. So I'm going to do that right now. Atish, you'll have to tilt the bike like you did the last time with the wheel. This is so that the wheel is off the ground and the suspension is unloaded. That way I know the total travel. So I've got 605 millimeters. And I'm going to make the calculation now so that the rear shock is set up at that 30%. We want it to be the same as the front. And for the rear shock, it works out to be about 37 millimeters of rider sag. So Atish, I'm going to ask you to get back on the motorcycle again. And Ram, if you can support the motorcycle from the front. And one important thing I wanted to mention was that when you're setting up your suspension, you have to have the rider sitting the way he normally sits on the motorcycle. So if it's a touring motorcycle, you need him to sit like he would on a touring motorcycle. The same thing, with a track bike tucked in, and on a dirt bike or an adventure motorcycle, we generally get them to set up the suspension while the guy's standing on the motorcycle.
So I try standing on this.
So Atish, I'm going to do the same thing I did for the front, but I'm going to bounce the rear shock. So I'm now at 570 millimeters. So if you minus that from 605, you get the correct sag that we're looking for. It's about 35 millimeters with Atish on board. So I think we're good to go, guys.
Awesome.
So with most motorcycles, the manufacturer actually provides a hook spanner, and in this case TVS has done that as well. And this is the tool that you're going to use to actually adjust the preload adjuster on the rear shock. For this motorcycle, they've used a cam style adjuster. On a lot of bikes, you have two locking rings, which give you a slightly finer adjustment. And another thing, guys, is when you're using this tool, you got to be careful. You can skin your fingers pretty badly. So just be a little careful while using this tool.
So now that we've got the preload sorted, I don't need to be in my gear anymore.
Yeah, now you don't need to be in your gear.
The next step is setting the rebound damping. But before we get into that, can you explain to us what rebound is, what damping is?
Yeah, so you have two components of setting up the damping on any suspension, whether it's a car or a bike. For a motorcycle, we generally like to set the rebound first and then move on to compression damping. And basically, if you think about how your suspension operates, every time it hits a bump in the road, the suspension is going to compress or close. So you're having the tire move closer towards the motorcycle. That's your compression. And obviously you have a spring inside. So once you compress the spring is going to want to push back. And that's where you have the rebound stroke. You're going to have the suspension unload and rebound. So you have a rebound system on on any motorcycle. Of course, with adjustable suspension like we have on the TVS here, you can actually, the rider or the end user can actually set up the rebound. And the reason you're going to be setting up the rebound is you want to slow down how fast the tire actually or the suspension actually uncompresses. So if you imagine that your suspension has velocity as it hits a bump, your rebound will actually slow the suspension opening up.
Okay. Now, what happens if your rebound settings are off?
So like I said, you have a spring inside, and the damping circuit is going to be controlling the oscillations of the spring. So if you have too much rebound, that is, it's going to resist the suspension, whether it's the front and the rear, from actually unloading. So if it's too slow, you could hit a bump or an undulation in the road, and you have the tire compressing, and it might not unload or uncompress fast enough. And when that happens, you'll actually have the wheels skipping across the road. And we all know, the only thing that's keeping our motorcycle on the road and keeping you from falling is the lovely tires that you have on the motorcycle. So you definitely don't want the tires skipping over the road surface.
And the flip side of that, if you have too much rebound?
Yeah, so if you have too much rebound, you can have a scenario where the same thing, you hit a bump, and when the suspension starts compressing or closing, it needs to open up fast enough where it's going to be ready for the next undulation or bump in the road. So you can imagine it closes, and then it's going to follow the contour of the road and open up at the correct rate. If you've got too much rebound damping, it's actually going to have the suspension packed down, and when that happens, you've actually lost ground clearance, and you're going to hit the next bump, and instead of the suspension opening up and being at the correct suspension travel and ready to hit the next bump, you're going to have it compress further, and eventually when it packs down enough, you're going to be at zero travel and bottom the suspension. Of course, that's a worst case scenario, but if you can imagine that, it's not really good for the way the bike tracks on the road.
Okay. Now, when you're setting up rebound, what are the things you're considering? Are you considering usage of the motorcycle, where you're using it? Are you considering the weight of the load on the motorcycle? What is it that you're thinking about when you're dialing in rebound?
It firstly depends on what kind of motorcycle you're riding, whether it's a street bike, it's going to be ridden on track, is it an off-road or adventure motorcycle, or a big heavy tourer. All these things come into play, as well as the riding style. Of course, to set a base setting, to set a base setting on the rebound, you're particularly looking at you want the suspension to basically compress and open up at a particular rate, and we do that with the motorcycle static. The rider is not on the motorcycle, and we bounce the fork, and we're basically looking for the way the suspension uncompresses on the rebound stroke. I don't want that too fast or too slow.
Right, so now let's get into dialing in the damping on the front and then the rear.
Yeah, so like I said, I don't really need you on the motorcycle, so you can just watch what I'm doing.
Sure.
It's pretty easy to set up your motorcycle if you know what you're doing, and I encourage people that when they have a new motorcycle to actually play around with the clickers, your rebound and compression and the preload. That's how you learn. Generally, street bikes, or bikes that we use every day, the settings or the adjustments, unless it's very, very high-end suspension, can be quite coarse. So it's not going to really make the motorcycle very unsafe or anything like that to ride. So definitely you guys should try your hand at setting it up. And the first thing I'm going to do with setting up the rebound is I'm going to, like what I did earlier, I'm going to bounce the suspension. So if you look at this now, when I bounce the front fork, you can see that you have oscillation in the suspension. Once the fork compresses and rebounds, if you look at it, if you look at it closely, it's actually a little bit more than one bounce. So the suspension compresses, it rebounds, and then it should settle. That's what we're looking for. But if your suspension pogos up and down, then you know you don't have enough rebound damping on the suspension, and we have to dial in or increase the rebound damping to set it up correctly. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take my screwdriver. That's all you need to adjust rebound on any motorcycle. And with the TVS, I believe they say the key works to adjust the rebound damping. And let me just check that. Okay, yeah, so you can actually turn the rebound adjuster with the key, so that's cool. But I mean, I would just use a screwdriver. Makes it a little easier. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dial the rebound in. So the rebound adjuster here is too far out. So I'm going to start with the right fork and then move to the left. So I've turned the adjuster in all the way, and I counted 25 clicks of rebound damping. And the reason I've turned this in all the way is with suspension, we actually count the clicks out. It's never clicks in. So you got to zero the clicks, turn it all the way in, and then start counting backwards. So I'm going to turn the rebound adjuster a few clicks out, and then see how it responds to the adjustment. So I'm going to bounce the fork now. So I'm actually pretty happy with the adjustment now. It seems to be, it slowed down quite a bit.
So what exactly are you looking for now?
Yeah, so after I've actually, turned the rebound adjuster all the way in and then turned it out 10 clicks. Now what I'm basically looking for compared to what I was looking at or we looked at earlier, earlier there was quite a bit of oscillation, and like you could see in the video, the fork compressed and then rebounded. It compressed again and then came to a stop. So what I'm looking for is that you basically want the suspension to compress, rebound, and then sit. It shouldn't go into like a second or third bounce pogo around. That's not what you're looking for. So right now it's in the ballpark. It seems to be pretty well set up. Of course, this is going to change. Once you go out and start riding, you might want to increase the rebound damping or reduce it a little bit.
Understood. And say I was to take this motorcycle to the track, how would I change the rebound suspension for that?
So, I mean, it just depends on, for example, how hard you brake, or when you come onto the gas. So if the suspension extends or opens up too quickly, it's going to unsettle the bike a little bit, especially for example, if you're coming down a main straight, you brake hard, the fork is compressing, correct? You let go of the brake. If the front fork pops up too fast, that's going to basically upset the attitude of the motorcycle. So you want that to be a little slow so that you can get back on the gas and it's nice and smooth.
Understood. So that is how you set up your front suspension rebound.
Yes.
But the Apache also has a rear rebound setting.
Yeah.
Let's move to the rear and figure out how to set that up.
Sure, let's do that.
Okay, so now that we've set the front suspension, we move to the rear for rebound damping. Is the theory the same?
Yeah, so the theory for rebound damping on both the front and the rear stays the same. We're basically looking for the same things. So I'm going to set the rear up now. Atish, if you can just straighten the bike so that it's vertical.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push down on the rear. And what we're basically looking for is we don't want the rebound to be too fast, same as the front. We need it to be controlled. So currently on the motorcycle right now, the rebound is a little too fast. And this would cause the suspension to top out, especially if you go over bumps or you brake hard. You can find the rear extending too fast. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take my screwdriver again. And same as we did up front, I'm going to turn in the clickers all the way. And then I'm going to turn it back. So for the rear, I've just turned the clickers 10 clicks out. Let's see how it's improved or slowed down the rebound. Yeah, so now I'm happy with the rebound. I think it's slow enough for what we're looking for. So I think we're done with rebound. So another thing I wanted to tell you guys about was static sag. We also look at static sag in the front and the rear. And for the rear, what we're looking for is if the static sag for the motorcycle is correct. And static sag is basically when there's no rider on board, it's just the weight of the motorcycle. If it's correct and our preload setting is correct, I should be able to lift the tail up slightly. So you can see I'm able to lift the rear end up slightly. So this basically means that we have some space for the suspension to extend up. If there was absolutely, if I was not able to lift the tail end up at all, that basically means that the rear suspension has topped out and it's going to make for a very harsh and uncomfortable ride.
Okay, so now we've covered preload, we've covered rebound damping. The third concept is compression.
Yes, yeah.
What is compression?
So if you think about it, compression is kind of the opposite of rebound damping. They're basically both doing the same thing. They're stopping the suspension from really oscillating. But one thing you got to think about is that with rebound, the oscillation is directly from the spring kind of extending the suspension. So that's a fixed value based on the actual spring rate. It doesn't change much. But with compression, it's a little more dynamic because if you brake really hard or suddenly, the suspension velocity is going to be, say, far greater than when you hit a bump at slow speed. So we're basically looking at, with damping, you're looking at the velocity of the suspension, the shaft velocity. So with compression damping, it can be a little bit more dynamic than rebound damping. And with compression damping, what we're looking for is, when the suspension compresses, it's basically giving you control over that by introducing a compression damping circuit inside the suspension. And the way we set it up is, it could be different from what we're looking for on track or what you look for on street. So the main difference would be, with the compression damping, would be that on the street you require a little bit more leeway because you could hit big obstacles or bumps on the road like a pothole or a speed breaker. For a track, we really don't have that. That kind of concern. With a track, we are looking at, basically, say you're hard braking into a corner. So, you basically add more compression damping. If you find that the fork is bottoming out too far, and the reason for this is, for example, with a racetrack, you don't want the suspension totally bottoming out when you brake hard, and the reason for that is if the suspension bottoms, you could have basically lose control of the front wheel. The front wheel will tend to wash out, and this is because when you bottom, you don't have any more suspension travel left, and all the stress goes onto the front wheel or tire, and that could cause you to wash out.
Okay, now let's get into adjusting the suspension and finding the right compression settings for the front forks.
So setting up compression physically is pretty much the same way we do it for rebound. So I'm going to take my screwdriver and turn the clickers in all the way. So I've zeroed the clickers now, and I'm going to turn this roughly about 10 clicks out. And the reason I'm doing that is we're going to go with what TVS recommends as a baseline, and TVS recommends 7 clicks out for if you're going to be using this motorcycle on the track, and if you're solo for comfort, they recommend 12 clicks out. So I'm going to stick with 10 clicks for the compression damping, and there's a reason for that. With the rebound damping, we're basically trying to control the force of the spring inside the fork. but with compression damping, it's a bit more dynamic.
Right.
We're trying to control the way the fork compresses, and that all depends on what kind of conditions you're riding on. So for the track, it'll be a little different, but if you're riding on the street, that's going to be a little more different. It's going to react differently.
Right.
So I think since we don't know much about the bike, at this point, I would go with what the factory recommends for compression damping.
And that's why for rebound, you could actually compress the fork and see how it's reacting.
Yes.
Because it's a standard
So
reaction.
I'm going to compress the fork with the compression damping as well, just so that I can get a feel of the motorcycle. But till the bike's actually out there on the road and you're on it, that's when we could actually dial in the compression.
Cool.
So I'm going to bounce the fork now, just so that I get a feel. So yeah, definitely, with the compression damping at 10 clicks out, I can feel that there's more resistance to actually pushing the fork down. So I think this should be roughly what we're looking at for right now.
Perfect. Now, we've set up compression for the front, but there's no compression settings for the rear.
Yes, yeah.
So the next thing we do...
Yeah, so guys, I mean, you're all out with setting the rear compression. But I think with what they've offered right now, I'm pretty happy with the way the bike is. I like the setup. It's it's got enough clickers. You got 20 plus clickers in and out, so you can really do quite a bit with the suspension the way it is.
Awesome. And there you have it. We've covered all of the basics: preload, rebound, compression. Kunal, is there anything else you'd like to say before we close out this video?
So a couple of things I wanted to talk about before we close this is, the first thing I wanted to point out was, that even though you set up your suspension, it's a very dynamic thing. So it's not like you set it up once and it's going to be, that it's set up permanently. It keeps changing, and this depends, apart from the terrain you ride on. As you get more and more comfortable with the motorcycle and you start pushing the motorcycle more, especially when you're out on the track, you're going to find that you would have to play around with the damping again to better suit your riding. And another thing I wanted to talk about was the ambient temperature. Like right now, when I'm setting up the suspension here in Pune, it's a pretty cool day outside. It's actually raining, unseasonal rain. So I mean, if you think about it, you have oil that's flowing through your damping system, and oil is going to be different viscosity based on temperature, and the suspension is no different. It is affected by the weight of your oil and whether it's thinner or hotter. And another thing you got to remember is, apart from the ambient temperature, your suspension also tends to get hot, because I mean the damping causes a lot of friction, and especially for the rear shock, you'll find that the rear shock tends to get hot, and it's going to reduce the viscosity of the oil. So it's going to be different than say in Pune, or maybe on a hot day in Chennai. And the difference is going to be that whatever setting you have, if it's a hotter day or you're riding really hard, you're really pushing the motorcycle, you would find that you would need to increase your rebound and compression damping just a little bit to compensate for the temperature. And while we're talking about oil, another thing I wanted to point out was that just like any other oil that you use on the motorcycle, like engine oil or brake fluid, suspension fluid also has a fixed life. So if you don't change the front fork fluid, of course a lot of the rear shocks aren't rebuildable, but at least you should look at like really maintaining the front fork fluid, and that would be changing it at set intervals so that your damping doesn't really break down over time.
And I think the crucial bit here to remember is that there's no fixed setting. There's no correct setting. So even though a professional might recommend a certain setting, at the end of the day, it's the feel that you get from the motorcycle that matters. So you need to take your bike out, ride it, understand what it's telling you, and then set up your suspension accordingly.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, in the end of the day, it's all about how comfortable you feel on your motorcycle, and that's the reason you got adjustable suspension, because they're trying to give you an opportunity to really get in there and adjust it as an end user and like we saw today. It's really not that difficult. You just need a few tools and a little time, and eventually it's going to become easier and easier and get you closer to, you know, really enjoying the motorcycle like the way you want to.
Exactly, and that's the best part about something like the RR 310. You don't have to be extremely mechanically minded to adjust the suspension on this motorcycle. Simple tools, and once you understand how the suspension works and what it's doing, you just have to play around with it and find the right settings for yourself. Thank you so much, Kunal, for your time today.
Thanks,
It's
Adish.
been really, really informative. There's a lot to take in here, but I think once you do that, you can have a much more enjoyable and a much better riding experience. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment down below. Did you learn something new today? We'd love to hear from you. And make sure you subscribe to the Evo India channel. While you're at it, go follow Slipstream Performance as well.